No, it's just I record when I sign. No, it's going to be too hard for me, though. I don't think I'm going to come. All right, so for today's lecture, we're going to describe blood flow through both the pulmonary and systemic circuits. We're going to describe the location, source, and anatomy of the heart in the thorax or chest cavity. We'll talk about the structural components of the heart and protective coverings. We'll go through flow of blood through the heart. We'll describe the operation of heart valves, common medical problems that can arise with them, and then medical interventions that can help resolve them. We'll talk about the system of coronary arteries and veins, their role in blood supply to the heart, and talk about medical interventions there. We'll define systole, diastole, heart sounds, and murmur, and then we'll talk about some common medical terms and conditions associated with the heart. So we'll do this review again. What is the arrow pointing at? Erythrocytes. What about this one? Eosinophils. The all white blood cells are called what? Leukocytes. This one's an eosinophil. What's the fragment? Platelet. What's the scientific thrombocyte? What's this one? Monocyte. And that one. Lymphocyte. You gotta look at size. It's going to be similar in size to the red blood cell. Okay. So the primary function of our cardiovascular system is going to be to transport blood and everything that's within the blood. And then the three main components of the cardiovascular system is blood, which we already covered, the heart, which is a pump, and then one thing about the heart, so its job is to pump blood. That's its only job. Okay? We talk about, I'll give you a hint. On your final exam, there's a question where there's a heart model and it asks you what's the function of this organ. It literally is just to pump blood. Okay? A lot of people end up putting delivery of oxygen. That's not really true. It's the vessels that deliver the oxygen. They take the blood from the heart to the tissues. The heart's only job is to pump that blood out. That's it. Okay? So the heart is a pump. And the vessels are the networks of tubes that are going to deliver that blood and that oxygen and nutrients out to the tissues and bring it back to the heart. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood back to the heart. So that's its only definition. Okay? So when you look at the textbook, you'll see that oxygenated blood is red and deoxygenated blood is blue. A lot of people have the misconception that all arteries are red and then all veins are blue. That is not true. Okay, the only definition for an artery is that it takes blood away from the heart. That's it. The only definition for a vein is that it brings blood back to the heart. That's it. Okay. So one way that I kind of remember which one is which. So A for artery, go like this. And I want you to put your fingers away from your body. They go like this. Arteries go away. Okay, arteries go away. Now you have this arrow that's pointing out away, right? And then you go veins. And you go down. Now the veins are bringing the blood back to you. Okay, so now the arrow is pointing to you. Okay, so arteries, arrow is pointing away. The arrow is pointing to you. Okay, don't do some crazy thing where you're trying to go this way. No, it goes straight out. Okay, straight out. All right, so we have two circuits. We have the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Is it hot in here? Okay, it's not this one. Okay, we have two circuits, a pulmonary circuit that's taking blood to and from the lungs, and then we have the systemic circuit to and from the body. Each circuit begins and ends with the heart, and all blood travels through these circuits in a sequence. Okay? So we're going to go through those circuits. So it's actually the right atrium. So before we get there, we have four sets of chambers. The atria are the receiving chambers on the top. I'm going to do it in black, it's a little bit easier. The top are the atria, and that's plural. And we'll talk more about them a little bit later. Atrium is singular. But we have our two atria at the top. Those are the receiving chambers. And then the chambers at the bottom are the ventricles. And so the right atrium is going to receive deoxygenated blood from the body. So here's the body. Deoxygenated blood has already been used, so we already delivered the oxygen to our tissues. Now the deoxygenated blood is coming back and into this first chamber. So the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the body, and then the blood, let me erase all these scribbles here. And the blood then goes down from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and the right ventricle is then going to pump that blood to the lungs. And that's going to begin our pulmonary circuit. And then it's going to go out to the lungs. We're going to reoxygenate that blood. We're going to put some oxygen in it, take out CO2. And then now the newly oxygenated blood is going to go to the left atrium. So the left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. And then once the right atrium has that blood, it's going to push that blood down into the right ventricle, the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle is then going to pump that blood out to the body. And that will be our systemic circuit. That's where it starts. So it starts here. So the systemic circuit would be the left ventricle to the body, and then the right atrium coming back. Okay. So from here, so it starts here. So left ventricle out to the body, oxygenate our tissues, and then when the deoxygenated blood comes back to the right atrium, that's the systemic circuit. Okay, you start with a ventricle, you end with an atrium. For the pulmonary circuit, same thing, you start with the ventricle, you end with an atrium. So the pulmonary circuit, you start in the right ventricle, that gets pumped out to the lungs, comes back to the left atrium. That's the pulmonary circuit. You start with the ventricle, you end with an atrium. Okay, questions? So the heart has 4 chambers and pumps blood to the pulmonary and systemic circuits. Your heart is a fist-shaped organ that sits in your thorax, okay, inside of your rib cage, but it's not perfectly in the middle. Okay, it's a little bit to the left, okay, and it's slanted a little bit. So your heart lies on the oblique lines of your body. So it's not straight standing up, it's a little bit like this. And actually the top or the base is actually going to be a little bit forward. Okay, so it's a little bit to the left, oblique, and a little bit anterior facing. Oh yeah, and I was going to ask you, what's that muscle? It's the diaphragm. Okay, so the diaphragm helps us to breathe and ventilate air. What kind of muscle is our diaphragm made from? Can you control your diaphragm? Can you? Yes. So then what do you think it's made from? Skeletal muscle. It actually is skeletal muscle. It does have some autonomic control because you can go to sleep at night and not have to worry about contracting your diaphragm, but you do have conscious control over it. You can take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, and you are telling your diaphragm to contract and relax. So your diaphragm is skeletal muscle, but there is also some autonomic control, so you don't have to think about it all the time. Your heart sits inside of the mediastinum. So this is a specific cavity. So you have your thoracic cavity, which is kind of the whole area, okay, but your mediastinum is a subcavity inside there. Okay, it's between your sternum and your vertebrae on the front and back side or anterior posterior sides, and then it's in between your lungs. So there's going to be a question on your exam that asks you what is the specific cavity that the heart, also the trachea and the esophagus sit in. And it's going to be the mediastinum. It's not the thoracic cavity. We are going to be more specific and say it's the mediastinum. And if you told me thoracic cavity, I'll probably give you partial credit. But when we're talking about just the heart, it sits in the mediastinum. Okay. And so for the heart, it's a little bit backwards than what you would think. So when you think of kind of like a mountain, the bottom is the base, and then the top is the apex. The heart is the opposite. Okay. The base is going to be at the top where all of our great vessels attach to. And we'll talk about the great vessels a little bit later. But this top part, where all those vessels attach, that's our base. And then our apex is where it comes to a point at the bottom. So base at the top, apex at the bottom. All right. Now next we're going to talk about the covering of the heart and thoracic cavity. Does anybody remember what this little box here, this layer here is? It is the layer of our serous membrane that lines the cavity that the lung sits in. Parietal what? For lung. Pleura. For the lung is pleura. For parietal pleura. What is the layer that actually touches the lungs? Visceral pleura. So we're going to talk about those, but for the heart. So, oh, I already have some notes. Yeah. Oh, no, I can't take them off. Okay. So we have some layers, protective layers of the heart. Now, you've already heard about the visceral and parietal pericardium. There's actually even a higher order level on the outside of that. There's a fibrous pericardium. So your fibrous pericardium is outside that serous membrane. It's a tough outer sac. And the reason why we need this tough outer sac is going to limit the contractions of the heart. So it's not going to limit its function, but it's going to keep the contractions within that mediastinum so that every time, because the heart is a very powerful muscle, it's so that every time it contracts, it's not beating up against the lung. Okay, so it kind of keeps those contractions held within the mediastinum without bumping into other organs. So the tough outer sac is attached to the diaphragm, because remember, this is going to go all the way around. So it's attached to the diaphragm on the inferior side here. And it's attached to the great vessels at the top, or the superior end. So questions about the fibrous pericardium. Again, it's just to keep the contractions held within that mediastinum. And then we have these serous layers that you should already be familiar with. We have the parietal layer, or the parietal pericardium, that's going to line the mediastinum that it sits in. Then we have the visceral pericardium. And one thing about the visceral pericardium, it actually has two different names depending on what we're talking about. So two kind of different structures are the pericardium on the outside of the heart, and then what we're going to talk about later is the actual heart wall. So the actual layers of the heart wall. Now, the visceral pericardium is part of both of those things. It's part of the outer covering, and it's also part of the actual heart wall. So it depends on what context we're talking about, what we're going to name it. Right? So when we're talking about the pericardium and the outside coverings, we're going to call it the visceral pericardium. But then when we're talking about the actual heart wall itself, it's called the epicardium. So imagine, do I have it somewhere? No, I don't. I don't think I do. Yeah, okay, I'm going to go back. So I'm going to draw this out for you. So we have the fibrous pericardium. And then we have the parietal pericardium. And then we have the visceral pericardium. But fluid is also referred to as the epicardium. And then when we get into the heart wall, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I wanted to introduce it now as well. We have the myocardium, which is the muscular part of our heart wall. And then we have the endocardium, which is the inner layer of our heart wall. And so these three here are part of the heart wall, while these three are part of the pericardium. And so essentially the visceral pericardium and the epicardium are the same thing. Right? But we call it the visceral pericardium when we're referring to the pericardium in those outer layers, and then we call it the epicardium when we're referring to the heart wall. Don't ask me why they gave two names for the same thing, but that's kind of how it goes. It'll be the same thing for another organ that we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, anybody still need this up? Okay, go ahead. Everybody getting it? I'm just going to go way further in 3, 2, 1. Okay. And so we're still talking about pericardium. So we have the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium, and then there's a space in between. So the space in between the parietal and the visceral pericardium is the pericardial cavity. So here's the parietal, here's the visceral, and the space in between is the pericardial cavity. No, it's not. Okay. So pericardial cavity is a thin space between those layers. And BW is for between. Between layers is the serous pericardium. Containing, does anybody remember what the fluid is in between? Serous fluid. Containing serous fluid. And that serous fluid is going to reduce friction from contraction. So any questions about the pericardium, the layers, the cavity? Everybody good with it? Anybody still need these notes up? Okay, go ahead. Everybody good now? So when you think about those layers, make sure you know that they are continuous. Okay? So it's like a little sack. It's not like two layers that have openings on the end. It's all continuous. So it can hold that serous fluid within it. So if you think about it, it's like if you were to put the heart or the organ into a balloon. Okay? Because the walls of that balloon will be continuous. And then we have the serous fluid in between. Okay, so those two layers are continuous with each other. There's no escaping of that serous fluid. It's all held within that sac between those layers. So again, it's like putting a heart or your fist through a balloon. Just note those are continuous with each other. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about pericarditis and how if it's untreated can turn into pericardial effusion, and if that's untreated, it can turn into cardiac tamponade. If you ever watch Grey's Anatomy, they talk about cardiac tamponade all the time. So pericarditis, talk about that first, is inflammation of the pericardium. So you see my little drawings here. Here's the parietal layer, here's the visceral layer, and the cavity in between. So when you have inflammation of the pericardium, those layers become inflamed, and that cavity gets smaller. And the space in between gets smaller because of the inflammation of the wall. And so causes of inflammation of the pericardium include viral infections. COVID-19 was associated with pericarditis. Fungal infections, bacterial infections, also parasitic infections. All of these things can cause pericarditis. Inflammatory disease, trauma to the heart, or inflammation after a heart attack. All of these different things can cause pericarditis. And so symptoms include chest pain. And the reason why we can get chest pain with pericarditis, as you can see, let me zoom in here. Those two walls are very close to each other now that there's inflammation here. So what can form are what are called adhesions, or those two walls can stick together. And so when they stick together and the heart contracts, they're pulling on each other, which is going to cause chest pain. Does that make sense? So you can have chest pain due to adhesions because it interferes with contractions. Because sometimes it's associated with infections, you may have fever. You're going to have fatigue or weakness because of the interruption of heart function. You may have heart palpitations and then shortness of breath as well. So questions about pericarditis. I'll give you a second to write down the notes. So you're like, there's just like a little space for you to write it down. Okay, everybody good here? This lecture shouldn't run over, so we're good with time. So if that pericarditis goes untreated, it can turn into something called pericardial effusion. And this is the accumulation of excess fluid in that pericardial cavity, also sometimes referred to as fluid around the heart. So the cause is the complication of the pericarditis. That pericarditis progressed into pericardial effusion. So what ends up happening, when we saw in the previous one, we had inflammation that caused that cavity to become smaller. But if you have that inflammation over the long term, you're going to have fluid buildup. The inflammation causes a buildup of fluid. And so as you build up fluid, those walls actually start to separate from each other, from the excess fluid. So they start off close, but because of the inflammation and the excess fluid production, we end up getting a big space in between those two walls. And so that's going to interfere with heart activity as well. So the symptoms of that are going to be chest pain. And if it does, it's a note to myself, if you had chest pain before and it went untreated, you're still going to have chest pain as it progresses. You're going to have shortness of breath. And the term or scientific term for shortness of breath is dyspnea. You're going to have discomfort when breathing lying down, which is called orthopnea. And then because of the excess fluid, you may also start getting swelling in the legs and abdomen. Yes. 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 And I actually have a copy of like the full, this is my little notes that I wrote on this, so I'll have this in lab if you want to take a picture, and I could post a PDF version of it on Discord and campus. Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah, it is on the previous one too. But in case you wanted it just by itself in the file, it's a little bit bigger. So any questions about pericardial effusion? Okay. So if the pericardial effusion goes untreated or doesn't resolve, then that can lead to cardiac tamponade. Cardiac tamponade is when pressure on the heart, when we have pressure on the heart, due to blood or fluid builds up in the space between the myocardium and the pericardium. So this is a complication of pericarditis and pericardial effusion. You'll have all of the above symptoms that we talked about before, but then you also may experience fainting, dizziness, and loss of consciousness. So what the issue is with cardiac tamponade, and I can go back in a second if you need to, is that, so first of all, with the pericarditis, again, I'm showing you those adhesions where the walls kind of stick together, and when it contracts and they kind of pull on each other, that's pericarditis. With cardiac tamponade, what happens is that you have so much fluid on the outside of the heart due to the pericardial effusion that you end up having this outward pressure onto the heart, right? And it ends up interfering with heart contraction. So now the heart can't contract as strongly. It won't be able to open up as much. It won't be able to fill as much either. And we're not going to get enough blood out to our tissues. Okay? It's like if you're trying to open a door and somebody's pushing it up against you and you can't open it. Okay? So when you have so much fluid buildup that it affects the contractions of the heart, that's when we call it cardiac tamponade. Okay? It's an opposing pressure, an outward pressure. So the heart does not stretch fully between contractions, so the chambers don't fill properly. You have decreased ventricular filling, which means less cardiac output. And so then the heart has to work harder to get the same amount of blood out. questions about that, or does anybody need me to go back? Okay. Go back. Yeah. Any questions about pericarditis or effusion or cardiac temperament? So when we have less cardiac output, again, that means less blood to the organs, less oxygen, less nutrients. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the walls of the heart. So we have 3 layers of our heart wall. This is from superficial to deep. The epicardium, which is the visceral pericardium, plus some connective tissue that's at the top. Epi means outside, so it's going to be the outermost layer of the heart. Then we have the myocardium. Remember, myo means muscle. This is where we have our cardiac muscle. This is the thickest of the 3 layers. And then also part of the myocardium is going to be our cardiac skeleton. So we have a cardiac skeleton, which is essentially just the connective tissue that is holding all of the valves in place. So you really can't see it on any of our models because you would have to cut it in half and look into it. But again, cardiac skeleton is just the connective tissue that is holding the valves in place. And then the innermost layer is the endocardium. This is the internal surface of the heart chamber. So this is the only layer that actually touches blood. This would be the inner layer of those heart chambers. So then again, we have the epicardium, which is the outermost layer. All of this is the myocardium, and then the endocardium is going to be the inner layer. Again, it's the inside of the chamber that's going to actually touch the blood that flows through the heart. So epi means above or outside, so it's the outermost layer. Endo means within, so it's going to be the innermost layer. All right, endocarditis. So endocarditis is inflammation of the endocardium, or that inner layer, and this is usually due to a bacterial or viral infection, more commonly bacteria. But what ends up happening is that when you get a infection or a bacteria growth on your valves, what's going to happen is that those valves are no longer going to be able to close properly because of the growth of bacteria on the outside. So you can see here's a normal aortic valve with no infection, and then here is the aortic valve with endocarditis, with the bacterial infection. So you can see how these valves come together versus when there's an infection or growth on it, then you have this space in between. So what's going to happen is that when the heart tries to pump blood out through the aorta, blood is now going to backflow and go back into the left ventricle where it came from, which means that the heart's going to have to work harder to keep getting that blood out that keeps backflowing. So questions about that? Okay. So we'll talk about the atria first, and then we'll get into the ventricles. Remember, atria is plural. Remember that. Or quick.
What are the symptoms of that?
You're going to have like fatigue and stuff like you would with other, like with the cardiac tamponade and such, is obviously a different condition. But when you affect heart function, you're going to get fatigue, shortness of breath, things like that, because your heart's having to work harder. Murmurs too. We'll talk about murmurs. That backflow. You'll be able to hear that backflow. We're going to listen to murmurs here in the lecture. So the atria, your right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from systemic circulation by 3 sources. So it's going to receive blood from the superior vena cava, which is returning blood from the top half of the body. It's going to receive blood from the inferior vena cava, which is receiving blood from the bottom half of the body. And then also the coronary sinus opening, which is returning blood that was delivered to the heart itself, and then it returns back to the heart, inside the heart, through the coronary sinus opening. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the blood that's inside the heart is not feeding the heart itself. That's to feed the body. So we have our own coronary circulation that's on the outside of the heart that feeds the heart itself. Okay? And so when we give that blood to the heart, and then it uses that oxygen, the deoxygenated blood returns back to the inside of the heart through this coronary sinus opening. So we'll talk more about coronary circulation later. The left atrium is then going to receive oxygenated blood from pulmonary circulation via the pulmonary veins. And so this is going to be one of our instances in which veins are not blue. Okay, so remember that arteries just mean that they carry blood away from the heart. Veins only mean that it brings blood back to the heart. Because these here are pulmonary veins bringing blood back to the heart from the lungs, but they're red because they're oxygenated. They just came from the lungs. So don't get that mixed up. We have what's called an inter means between, interatrial septum. So it's a septum or a wall in between the atria. It's going to be right around here, and I believe I have a picture that shows it. Yes. So this is a coronal cut of the heart, and so you can see that there's this wall that's there in between those 2 atria. That's the interatrial septum. Now, there is a structure that we have in our heart called the fossa ovalis. Where's another part of the body that we have a fossa ovalis? In the skull. You guys remember all those holes you had to learn about 32? Fossa ovalis is one of them. Again, I don't know why they give the same name to different things, but they do. So our fossa ovalis in the heart is actually a remnant of the fetal foramen ovale. So you have a fetal foramen ovale that's not in the skull, it's in the heart. So when a baby's in utero, its lungs aren't inflated yet. It receives oxygen from mom. Okay? So a fetus's heart does not have the same circulation as I would say human heart, but once you're born and your lungs inflate, then you take on a different circulation. So when you are a fetus, there's actually a hole in between your 2 atria. Okay, because there's no need for the delivery to the lungs and back because the lungs and heart don't work like that just yet. And so while you're a fetus, there's a hole in between the 2 atria. Okay, and so right before you're born, that hole closes up. And when it closes up, it leaves a little bit of an indentation. If you remember, a fossa means a shallow indentation. Okay, so it leaves a little bit of an indentation. It's closed now, but there's an indentation there. It's called the fossa ovalis. Okay, so that fossa ovalis is a remnant or a leftover of the hole that was there when you were a fetus. Sometimes, though, that hole doesn't close up properly, and that's called an atrial septal defect. For most babies, they resolve on their own. You can prescribe steroids, perhaps, to increase the development speed, but usually those resolve on their own, but there are times where surgery is needed in order to correct it. So when there is a hole left over, it's called an atrial septal defect. There are different kinds of atrial septal defects, but an atrial septal defect, it is congenital, which means that you're born with it. So it's an ASD, atrial septal defect. So congenital, meaning you're born with it. And the one that we're talking about now, where there is a hole left over, where that foramen ovale or ovale doesn't close up properly, we call it a patent. And patent means open. Foramen ovale. And so what ends up happening, because remember your right atrium has deoxygenated blood that's going to go eventually to the lungs, and then your left atrium has oxygenated blood, okay, that just came from the lungs. And so if you have a patent or open foraminal valley where it didn't close up properly, then you're going to have backflow from the left atrium back to the right atrium. So now you're mixing up oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, which means that the body may only be getting partially oxygenated blood if those two bloods are mixing. So it can lead to heart failure. Again, most of the time they resolve on their own, but if it's really bad, you may need surgery. If it's not treated, that baby can go into heart failure. You can have what's called pulmonary hypertension, where there's a backup of blood to the lungs. It can cause arrhythmias. And then it can also cause stroke from the lack of oxygen to the brain. And again, with that backflow, you get a mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So questions about a patent foraminal valley or atrial septal defect. And again, this is just one type of atrial septal defect. Okay, anybody still need these notes up? Again, that's just showing you that interatrial septum. Now we're going to talk about the ventricles. So the right ventricle on this side is going to pump deoxygenated blood out to the lungs via what's called the pulmonary trunk, which you'll learn about today in lab, or you'll identify today in lab. And then the left ventricle pumps now oxygenated blood to the body by the aorta. And so the pulmonary trunk and the aorta are both considered great vessels. Those are the ones that attach to the top of the heart. And so just like the interatrial septum, there's also an interventricular septum, which is the wall in between of the two ventricles. So I erase all of this. The interventricular septum is here. So this wall between the right and left ventricle. We can also have what's called a ventricular septal defect. This is congenital in infants and children. But it can also be due to an MI or a heart procedure can cause a ventricular septal defect later in life. And an MI we'll talk about later is a myocardial infarction, which is otherwise known as a heart attack. So when it's congenital, so I'll write it here. When it's congenital, it's due to an underdeveloped septum or ventricles. And the same thing is going to happen. We're going to have backflow in between those two chambers, mixing of blood. And that's going to lead to all the same symptoms or conditions with the atrial septal defect. So that can lead to heart failure, again, pulmonary hypertension, arrhythmias, and stroke. So any questions about the ventricles or ventricular septal defect? Yeah. The interatrial system? So on this diagram, you can't see it because the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary semilunar valves are hiding it. So you can only see it on this picture that I have of an actual heart. So you can see the wall in between. So like on the exam, if I were to ask for the interatrial septum, I would put a sticker on the inside of the heart on one side of the wall, and I would give you context. I would say, what is the name of the wall that separates this chamber from the other chamber on the right or left, whatever it is. And then you would tell me it's the interatrial septum. So I'll give you context and questions like that. So we're good here? So typically the left ventricular wall is 3 times as thick as the right. Can anybody guess why that is? Not lack of oxygen. So where yeah, so they both have to pump it out, but the right side of the heart, where is it pumping out to? The lungs. Okay? So the right side of the heart is pumping out to the lungs. Are the lungs very far away from the heart? No. But then the left side has to be able to pump out to the entire body, all the way to the brain, all the way down to the toes. So that's a much farther distance. So the left side of the heart and the left heart wall needs to be much thicker and much stronger than the right side because it's pumping on a larger distance or a longer distance. Does that make sense? So next we're going to talk about valves. Isn't that cool looking? What was that? Oh, just in time of relativity. So why do we have valves? What do they prevent? Backflow. They prevent backflow. And so we have 4 valves. We have 2 atrioventricular valves. And you can call them the right and left atrioventricular valves if you would like, but they have other names that are used in the medical field. So we have the tricuspid valve on the right side, and then we have the bicuspid valve, also known sometimes as the mitral valve, on the left side. So tricuspid on the right, bicuspid on the left. How I remember that, because remember, blood flow goes from the right side, so right atrium, to right ventricle, out to the lungs, and back to the left atrium, left ventricle. And so the way that I remember which side is which is that you try before you buy. Try before you buy. So tricuspid comes first on the right side, bicuspid is next on the left side. Those 2 valves, your tricuspid and bicuspid valves, they are held to the heart by what are called chordae tendineae. And chordae tendineae are, if you ever heard somebody say, oh, you're tugging on my heartstrings, that's what they're referring to. We actually have heartstrings in our heart. Okay? They are called chordae tendineae. Well, I guess I can keep that, so I'm about to talk about it. So those chordae tendineae are attached to what are called papillary muscles. So we have these little finger-like muscles on the walls of the heart called papillary muscles. And so they are attached to those chordae tendineae. Those chordae tendineae are attached to the valves. And so what they do is they contract and pull on those heartstrings, and it closes the valve. And then they relax, and those strings loosen up, and it opens up the valve. So those are what those are for. Questions about that mechanism? Okay. Then we have what are called semilunar valves, and we have two of them. They look like two little half moons or crescent moons. The one on the other side looks like little butt cheeks or something. But those are our semilunar valves. We have a pulmonary semilunar valve, which blood flows through before it gets out to the lungs on the right side. And then we have an aortic semilunar valve over here that blood flows past, going out to the rest of the body on the left side. So we have a pulmonary semilunar valve and an aortic semilunar valve. They don't use the chordae tendineae. They do not use papillary muscles. They work off of pressure. And we'll talk more about how they work right now in a second. So question about those four valves. And on the exam, you need to say it is the pulmonary semilunar valve or the aortic semilunar valve. Okay, not just pulmonary valve or aortic valve. You want to use semilunar. That I know, that you know, they're different shapes, different functions. So the atrioventricular valves, or our tricuspid and bicuspid, those are for blood that stays within the heart, just going from the atrium to the ventricles, while the semilunar valves are for blood that's leaving the heart or being ejected from the heart. Okay, so again, how those chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles work is that when the ventricles fill up enough with blood, those papillary muscles, again, are going to contract and pull on the cords, which is going to close up the valve. Okay, once it's already been filled up enough, then we close that valve, and then we can eject through the other valve. Now, the semilunar valves, they're going to work off of pressure. So again, once the ventricles fill up enough and those atrioventricular valves have been closed, what's going to happen is that the heart is going to do small little contractions to build up the pressure. And once the pressure in the chamber here is greater than the pressure in the vessel that's ahead of it, then that valve is going to open up, and then we'll be able to eject that blood. Okay? And then once the pressure in the ventricle is less than the pressure in that valve or in that vessel, now that it has received that blood, then it can close back up and prevent that backflow. So your semilunar valves work off of changes in pressure, while your atrioventricular valves are going to rely on those papillary muscles to contract when they're supposed to close those valves. So questions about that? You have a question? You look right here. No, you're good? Promise? Okay. You're not going to have to know the exact steps, and I won't test you really on the mechanism in detail. Just know that the atrioventricular valves rely on those papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae, while the semilunar valves rely on changes in pressure. That's all you got to know. So don't let the diagram get you a little nervous. Okay. So we already talked about congenital birth defects with the ASD and the VSDs. Talked about endocarditis already. Then there's something called valvular stenosis. Right? That's when the valves become hardened, and most importantly, and what stenotic means is that those valve openings become more narrowed. And this could be due to age, could be to heart damage. There's a lot of different causes of valvular stenosis. Could also be something that you're more genetically prone to. But what happens here? Here's a normal aortic valve, nice and open here. and then when it closes, it does seal and close properly. But then if you have valvular stenosis, where the valves become hardened and the opening becomes more narrow, here it is open. Okay, again, that valve opening is now more narrow. Not as much blood is going to be able to pass through. And because the edges of that valve are hardened, when it tries to close, it's not going to properly close. There's going to be a little bit of an opening, which is going to cause what? Backflow. Okay. And this is a semi-lunar valve, so this blood is trying to be ejected. It's going to now backflow back into the ventricles, and so the heart is going to have to pump either harder or faster in order to get that blood out and get those organs and tissues oxygenated enough. And so when the valve doesn't close properly, that's called prolapse. And when the blood does backflow, and that can produce a murmur. So how does a heartbeat sound? Loved up, right? So those noises that you're hearing, it's not the actual closing of the valve, but it's when the valves close, blood pushes up against it, and that's the sound that you hear. That's the loved up. Okay? So it's the semi-lunar valve, no, it's the AV valves and then the semi-lunar valves, and then the AV valves and the semi-lunar valves. So they close, and then blood hits up against it. Then the semi-lunar valves close, and then blood hits up against it. So that's the noises that you're hearing, the loved up that you're hearing. So loved up, loved up, loved up. When you have a prolapse, because valves are not closing properly, and then blood backflows, what you're going to hear is a whooshing sound in between those love ducts. If it's after the love, then it's a problem with your AV valve. If it's after the dub, then it's a problem with your semi-lunar valve. So what you're going to hear is either la whoosh dub, where you hear that whooshing sound from that backflow, or it'll be love dub whoosh, love dub whoosh. Okay, so you can kind of hear for that. Don't ask me which valve it is on the video because I'm not professionally trained to hear for that. I just know the mechanism for it. So I'm going to show you a normal heart sound, and then I'm going to show you a murmur where you'll be able to hear that whooshing sound in between. Here. On the thing. And now it's me. Now it's coming up on my thing over here. Plug it and plug it back in. I know you guys are hearing it, right? But it's just not loud. Give me 1 second, because I do want you to hear it. Oh, you guys can't hear that, huh? That's slow. It's too low. Okay. turn off that one so we're going to hear like a million different things at one time.
Professor, try the volume on the actual YouTube channel or the,
This,
right?
no, that's already, it's already all the way on. It works every semester. What is going on this semester? I guess you're gonna have to just believe me. Oh yeah, or you can play it in this pal session. Or make sure you listen to it on your own. I really want you to hear it though. Not even this guy is working. So maybe the audio is not working in this room. I have to put in the ticket. It's not playing anything. Not on any of these things. Well, now I'm sad. Sorry, y'all. But the links are there. Watch it when you have some time. It is interesting to hear the whoosh in there. Now I'm sad. But okay, let's move on. All right, so we have, again, two circuits, pulmonary and systemic. The pulmonary circuit is going to transport blood to and from the lungs. The goal here is to deliver deoxygenated blood to the lungs and then return oxygenated blood now from the lungs to the heart. So we're picking up or replenishing our oxygen. Well, the systemic circuit is to transport blood to and from the body, and the goal is to drop off or deliver oxygenated blood to the body and then return that deoxygenated blood to the heart, so then we can use the pulmonary circuit to replenish the oxygen. Okay. So now we're going to talk about coronary circulation. So why does the heart need its own blood supply? Bless you. Because a hard-working muscle, it needs oxygen, and it's too thick to diffuse. So what I mean by it's too thick to diffuse, I mentioned before that the blood that's inside the heart does not feed the heart itself, because that heart wall is really, really thick, and you wouldn't be able to diffuse that blood out to the heart wall. So the blood that's inside the heart chambers is only for delivery to the rest of the body. Okay, that's it. So the heart has its own circulation, which we call coronary circulation. And so from the aorta, we have two branches off the aorta, the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. And those are to serve the heart itself. So the left coronary artery is more muscular because it's on the left side of the heart. Remember, the left side is more muscular because it has to deliver the blood a longer distance. So it's more muscular, which means that there's going to be more coronary arteries to serve it. So we're going to have more coronary arteries on the left side than we do on the right side. And so the first coronary artery off the left coronary artery is what we call the circumflex artery. The circumflex artery is this guy right here that wraps around to the back of the heart. So it's this one right here. So the way that I remember the circumflex artery, I think of a circumference of a circle. It's going to round around the back. Okay? The circumflex rounds around the back. Then the other vessel that comes off of the left coronary artery is something called the anterior interventricular artery. In clinical settings, it's called the left anterior descending artery, or the LAD. You're free to call it either one. Okay. Either the atrial interventricular artery or the left anterior descending artery. You can't use abbreviation. This is not a hormone. It is clinically referred to as the LAD, but on a practical, you need to say the left anterior descending artery or the anterior interventricular artery. If you're more good with med terms, and I'll come to you in a second, Susie. If you're good with med terms, then anterior interventricular artery may make more sense to you because it's on the anterior side of the heart and it's in between the ventricles. But if you've heard LAD before, then maybe it might be a little bit easier to remember left anterior descending artery. It's the one that's on the left. It's anterior and it's descending or coming down the heart. Okay. What was your question, Susie?
What you just said.
You're welcome. So on your learn list, and especially for vessels, when you see one vessel named here and then two vessels that are like indented after that, that means that these two here branch off from that one. Okay? So we have the left coronary artery first, and it's going to fork. And the left anterior descending artery is going to go in one direction. The circumflex is going to go in another direction. But they're both coming off of that left coronary artery. Okay. So you can see that here. Now, a lot of our models, you can't really see the left and right coronary artery all that great. Well, you can see them, the extensions of them, but you can't see where they come off the aorta, because the pulmonary trunk's right in the front and you just can't see the connections there on the aorta. I'll have a really big heart model that I'll show you guys where you can see that, but on most of the other heart models you won't be able to. But this diagram here kind of makes the parts look a little bit translucent so you can see what's happening underneath. So you can see here's the left coronary artery coming off the aorta, and then the right coronary artery coming off the aorta. But we're talking about the left side right now. So coming off of this left coronary artery, we have two arteries that are going in different directions. The circumflex going in this direction, coming around the heart, and then that left anterior descending artery or anterior interventricular artery coming down. Okay. So those both branch off of the left coronary artery. All right, questions about those? And you'll identify those on the models in lab today. So again, both the right and left coronary arteries branch off the ascending aorta, which is the first part of the aorta. But the right side now has what we call the marginal artery, and then also the posterior interventricular artery. So I'll show you those. So the marginal artery, so here's the right coronary artery. It's much longer than the left. But then this guy right here is the marginal artery coming off of the right coronary artery. If you want to make a note, it's number 63 on your models. It's the marginal artery. I don't know how I remember the number, but on that one I do. And then the posterior interventricular artery is actually on the back side. And again, both of these come off of the right coronary artery. Okay. So when we look at the right coronary artery, again, it's much longer than the left. So, and you can see it in the back. So here's the right coronary artery. It wraps around the heart and then comes to the back here. And then this extension down, that is the posterior interventricular artery. What we're going to talk about when we get to vessels are anastomoses. Anastomoses is where two vessels kind of separate from each other and then they converge and come back together. So it's a connection between two arteries. Could be veins too, but we'll talk about the artery examples. So you can see here, and I'll erase some of this marking so I can make it more clear. So remember we had that anterior interventricular artery, and then we have this posterior interventricular artery that comes off the right coronary artery, and they actually meet right here at the bottom, creating an anastomosis. Okay, again, we're going to talk more about that when we get to vessels. And then also that right coronary artery that comes around to the back of the heart on the right side, and then the circumflex that's coming around to the back of the heart on the left side, those also meet up again, creating an anastomosis. Okay. So I'm just previewing that to you now. You don't have to know it just yet, but when we talk about it the week after next, then you'll have to know what those two anastomoses are. Okay. Questions about the marginal artery or posterior interventricular artery? So that's another reason why anterior interventricular artery might be a little bit easier to remember, because it meets up with the posterior interventricular artery. They're partners. All right, so you can see that also on the back side. Here's the right coronary artery coming this way, and then the posterior interventricular artery coming down. So this way, and then down this way. All right, so I don't know if you're going to remember this already, but what was number 1? What's the first branch off? Oh, go ahead.
Is our model a more translational part, or is it going to be that part?
It's going to be like this.
Okay.
Yeah. So you'll have to turn it around. But on a practical, you're free to pick it up, turn it around, do all those things. All right, so what's number 1? Which, right or left? Left coronary artery. Remember, it's going to be, you have to switch it in your head because the person's facing you. What's number 2? That wraps around the back. The circumflex artery. What's the one coming down the front?
Left anterior descending artery.
Left anterior descending or anterior interventricular artery. What's number 5? What's that one that I said was number 63 coming off the right coronary? Oh, wait, no, number 4. Haha. What's number 4?
Right marginal artery.
No, this one, number 4. Sorry, I thought I was pointing at that one.
Right coronary.
The right coronary artery. And then number 5, what's the one coming off the right coronary?
Posterior introvert.
No, the one in the front. Right marginal artery. Now, you could just call it the marginal artery. I'm okay with that. I think your learn list might just say marginal artery. So either one is fine. But we'll look at that more and you'll review it more in lab. All right. So after we deliver the oxygen to the heart itself through those coronary arteries, then it's the what they're called cardiac veins that are going to return that blood back to the inside of the heart. So we have all the blue vessels on the model are the cardiac veins. We have an anterior cardiac vein, small cardiac vein, great cardiac vein. I'm going to tell you now, I never test on those. So I'm not going to make you learn something I'm never, ever going to test you on, or it's not even a possibility. So you can just, as a group, the blue vessels that are on the heart, you can call those the cardiac veins as a group. Right? So those are the cardiac veins. Obviously, I don't test you on everything, but at least there's possibilities for me to test you on it because things change every semester. But I never, ever test on the names of those. So as a group, they are the cardiac veins. And then what they're going to do is they are going to dump all that blood that was just used to deliver oxygen to the heart. We're going to now take that deoxygenated blood and empty it into what's called the coronary sinus. Okay? A sinus is just a large vessel or large vein. Hey, where have you had a sinus before? That was a vessel. You remember the dorsal venous sinuses that you had in the brain that returned the CSF back to circulation? So now we have these sinuses as well. Okay, so these are the coronary sinus. So this big vessel here in the back, you see where it gets a little bit thicker? That's the coronary sinus. And again, a sinus is just a large vein. But all of the deoxygenated blood goes into the coronary sinus. And then on your models today, you're going to find on the inside of the heart a little hole where the blood goes into the heart from there. So from the coronary sinus, inside the right atrium, there's a little hole called the coronary sinus opening. So that's where the blood goes from the coronary sinus into the heart itself. So I wonder if one of these other pictures shows it. Nope, so I'll have to show you in lab. All right. So some coronary conditions, we can have what's called coronary ischemia. Ischemia is when your vessels narrow for whatever reason and your oxygen to that tissue is lowered. So coronary ischemia here, again, not getting enough blood to the heart. And this right here, this example is due to plaque. So we have plaque buildup here We have a blood clot also that can obstruct blood flow. Okay, but anytime you're not carrying enough blood to that tissue, it's ischemia. So coronary ischemia is where you have some kind of obstruction in your coronary arteries that's not allowing you to get enough blood to the heart. And then angina pectoris is then when you have not enough oxygen to the heart and it causes chest pain. So angina pectoris is the chest pain that's associated with coronary ischemia. Okay, so coronary ischemia is when you have partial obstruction that's not allowing you to get enough blood to the heart. But then the pain that you feel because you're not getting enough oxygen is angina pectoris. Okay, so questions about coronary ischemia or angina. It's sometimes referred to as angina, but you want to say angina pectoris because it's talking about chest specifically. All right, so how do body cells make ATP or cellular energy to do work? Remember, through glycolysis, you get 2 pyruvates, and then if there's enough oxygen, then we're going to use the mitochondria to do aerobic respiration, which is going to give us about 32 ATP per glucose. If we don't have enough oxygen, then we're going to go through anaerobic glycolysis, and we're only going to get 2 ATP per glucose. So why coronary ischemia and angina is so dangerous is because your heart cannot rely on 2 ATP per glucose. There's no way. Okay, it works 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It never ever stops working. There's no way that it can live off of 2 ATP per glucose. So when heart cells, and remember that we need ATP in order to break the cross bridge between actin and myosin. Okay? So if we don't have the energy to separate those two, then they're going to stay together, and that you're going to have that contraction be stuck, right? And so if you don't have enough oxygen going to the heart and that heart tissue dies and you lack ATP, what's going to happen is you're going to experience a myocardial infarction or a heart attack where the heart does contract and get stuck in that position due to a lack of ATP and due to the death of those heart cells. And so when you look at, and remember, although it's commonly called a heart attack, you need to refer it as a myocardial infarction on an exam. But you can see here, part of the heart dies when that happens. When you have coronary ischemia, that's bad enough that you're lacking oxygen to the heart and those cells die. They lack that ATP and you experience a heart attack. And if you remember from tissues, heart cells do not regenerate. We don't get new ones. So once part of your heart dies, you're not going to get it back. Okay? And so then what's left of your heart has to work harder to maintain the same amount of oxygen delivery, which is going to make you more susceptible to a subsequent heart attack, which then more of your heart cells would die, your heart tissue would die, leaving you with even less healthy heart tissue, which eventually you would need a transplant. Yeah?
So that's kind of like the same with the brain cells, right? Like when people have
Yeah,
stroke.
same with the brain. Once you lose those brain cells, you don't get them back. All right, so treatments for coronary artery disease like coronary ischemia include a vasodilator. So you can take nitroglycerin tablets. Those are going to be lipid soluble. And so things that are lipid soluble can cross the membrane easily, right? So you can actually put those underneath the tongue and they'll dissolve underneath the tongue and they'll diffuse into your bloodstream. And then that'll help with dilating those vessels that are experiencing that ischemia. We can also do a balloon angioplasty with a stent insertion. When I ask you for this procedure, say the entire thing, a balloon angioplasty with a stent insertion. So I'll show you the one with, this is just a balloon angioplasty with no stent. So what happens is just to show you, but you're going to insert a catheter through the groin area up into the heart, okay? And you're going to have a balloon there and you're going to inflate the balloon. Inflating the balloon is going to open up that artery so you can restore more blood flow, okay? But then we also do one with a stent insertion. where you have a balloon that's inflated to dilate that vessel, but then the balloon is retracted and the stent stays in its place. So the stent keeps it open. Okay. So that's a balloon angioplasty with a stent insertion. And that should help restore blood flow for a good amount of time. Question about that? We can also we can do a coronary artery bypass graft. And with a bypass graft, you're literally just bypassing where the blockage is. Okay? They may take vessel walls from your legs. They sometimes do that. They graft them from your legs and they put them in your heart. Okay? Because it's your own tissue, so you shouldn't reject it. It's easier than an actual transplant from someone else. So take vessel wall from the legs, which you have lots of veins in your legs, so you can afford to lose some of that, and they put it in your heart. You're going to do a bypass today in lab. Not a real one, obviously, but a simulated one. And then what is the clot-busting enzyme we learned about last time? Yeah, but the actual chemical that breaks down the clot. TPA. What does TPA stand for? Tissue plasminogen activator. Okay, remember that. Unless you only want half a point on the practical, then you can just say TPA. All right. So this is just showing you, and we're almost done, we're almost out of time too, but here is where the blockage has occurred, because you can see blood flow has stopped. There's a space there where there's an obstruction. Then we do a balloon angioplasty with that stent insertion, and now blood flow is restored. So you can kind of see the before and after for that. So you do have a post-lecture assignment. This is PLA number 4, where you are going to do blood flow through the heart. Now, there is a diagram in your textbook to help you remember that. You can use this diagram to help you do that as well. The PLA gets you started. It tells you where to start, inferior vena cava to the tricuspid valve, and so on and so forth. One thing to remember, this is our first of what are called trace-a-drops, where you do a trace-a-drop of blood or urine or other things that we'll talk about, and you're going to give a flow. Okay? When you give that flow, you want to give only one option for a flow. When we get to blood vessels, there's going to be different routes that you can take. You want to take a single route. So if you look at your lecture notes, it starts with just the inferior vena cava. So you're not going to do superior and inferior vena cava. You want to choose one. Well, I already chose it for you. It's inferior vena cava. But if we're tracing a single drop of blood, it's not going to be able to flow through the superior and inferior at the same time. You want to take a single pathway. So that's why I just said inferior vena cava. You could start with a superior vena cava as well. But then you go right atrium, tricuspid valve, and then you have to do the rest. Okay? Any questions about that? That'll be due on Monday when I see you again. And then before we start lab today, we're going to do our quiz, and then we'll do some genetics problem solving from the video you should have watched. Yeah. Yeah, come down here. Oh, actually, I'll put it up. For anyone that missed the case study, there it is. And I'll stop the recording.